Hey, welcome back everybody to lesson 32 of the Dead Earth game development series brought to you by the Game Institute. I'm Gary Simmons and today I'm pretty excited because in this lesson we are going to ragdoll the shit out of Zombie Jill. Oh yeah. Now if you don't know what ragdoll means or what ragdoll physics is, we need a bit of historical perspective. In the days of yesteryear, when computer systems weren't fast enough to give us access at runtime to physics systems such as Unity's, the death sequences for our NPCs would be pre-canned animations, much like the animations that we have for our run, walk, feeding and attack sequences. The problem is, an NPC can die in a whole variety of different scenarios, which means you need to have an appropriate library of death sequences to fit each of those scenarios. If, like me, you're a little short on cash and you don't have access to a mocap studio or the budget to afford Andy Serkis in a mocap suit, that's going to be a problem. It's going to take a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of searching on the internet to find all of the different death sequences that may be required by your game. Pre-canned death sequences also come with a lot of problems in a game. Don't get me wrong, if you're creating a cinematic sequence, nothing looks better than a mocap recorded death sequence. If our NPC gets shot in the stomach, we can have the character clutch his stomach before dramatically dropping to its knees, and then finally at the final frame of the animation, ending up face down in a puddle of blood. But pre-canned animations are not without their problems at runtime. Let's imagine, for example, that your NPC is standing on a flight of stairs. When you play that death sequence, the last frame of that sequence is how the zombie is going to end up dead on the floor. So if that death sequence has been recorded with the actor lying horizontally on a flat floor, it will end up with its hips on a stair, for example, but the top half of its body seemingly hovering in mid-air. The other problem is that the animator component, which is of course in control of our bones when we're playing animations, does not listen to the physics system or the collision system at all. So, if your NPC is standing next to a solid wall, when it falls down into its death pose and ends up led out on the floor, the top half or bottom half of the body could very easily be embedded in geometry. And you can see things like this in a lot of older games, and even in games such as Left 4 Dead, which I thoroughly enjoyed playing. Because there are so many zombies in such a game, I think they probably chose not to use rigid body physics on each of them because it would just be too expensive. But you can find plenty of cases where when you walk around the level you can see dead zombies that you've previously killed, embedded in walls and other geometry in the scene. What we want is a situation where at a time of our choosing, when we decide the zombie is dead, we switch control of the bone system of our zombie from the animator over to the physics system. We treat each bone in the zombie as its own rigid body that is influenced by all of the physical forces in the scene, gravity and any other forces that we may apply. When we do this, we can very easily, without any work ourselves, have our zombie fall down a flight of steps and end up at the bottom of those steps in a big bundle of broken bones. And of course this is pretty much the way that we are going to want to do it in Dead Earth. This is called Ragdoll Physics. And in Dead Earth we're not just going to say when a zombie gets shot it's going to turn into a ragdoll. We're going to also have pre-canned hit sequences. So if you shoot the zombie in the stomach, you might see an animation play out where it just steps backwards or clutches its stomach. Only when the zombie is dead, or if there's going to be a headshot that's going to kill it outright, are we going to let that zombie turn into a ragdoll and let physics take over the animation of its body parts. And there's nothing complicated about making a zombie a ragdoll. It's using components which for the most part we've been using all along. We just make the bones, colliders and rigid bodies, and we connect them together with joints, which is something we haven't covered yet, but you'll see in a minute even this can be set up automatically for us by Unity. So the best way to see this is if I hop over to the production version of Dead Earth. You can see I have a Zombie Jill instance here in my abandoned hospital scene. If I select Jill's bone hierarchy, you can now see, if you take away those big spheres on her hands and the big mouth trigger, which our Zombie Jill has as well, you should be able to see that we've just basically got colliders and rigid bodies on each of Jill's most influential bones. So if I just turn off Jill's mesh for a moment so we can just see the skeleton and how it's been bounded with colliders. Each one of these colliders, if I just select Jill's left arm, you can see it has a regular capsule collider on it. It has a regular, non-kinematic rigid body so that it will act under the forces of the physics system. And it also has a character joint that links it to other body parts with other colliders on them. So really, when you think about it, without the joints, we can imagine that if at some point in our game we decide that we wish to ragdoll our character, if every bone, or at least all the main bones, have colliders and rigid bodies on them, the physics system will take care of the rest. We know what happens to rigid bodies with colliders. They fall under gravity and they can have forces applied to them. So if we shot a zombie in the chest and applied a force there, the zombie would be blown backwards. And that's what we're going to use for things like shotgun damage and things like that. Of course, if we didn't use joints, Unity wouldn't really know that these rigid bodies that represent the character's bones should be connected together. We might see a situation where if you shot a zombie on a flight of steps, all of the body parts would go bouncing off in different directions. Now that might sound cool, and you might think, oh yeah, I want that to happen. But of course, it wouldn't look right, because although we're using the physics system to animate the bones now, those bones are still covered by a skin, by a mesh. So even if the arms and the legs went bouncing off in different directions, there would be this massive stretched skin still sort of stretching over all the bones, and it would look very, very distorted. And finally, before we go and ragdoll our version of Jill, it's worth mentioning that when the physics system is in control of the bones of our character, we have to make sure that the animator component is turned off so that it isn't too trying to animate the bones of the character. What you'll have then is two completely different systems with distinctly different objectives trying to set the transform of our bones, and we can't have that. And you'll see, if you forget to turn the animator off, the two systems will literally fight against each other and the animation will jitter and it will just look very, very buggy. So in our code, we're going to make sure that when the zombie is dead and should be ragdolled, we turn the animator off, and then we turn all of the physics colliders on, or at least we turn them from non-kinematic to kinematic so that they become influenced by the physics system. And that's all we have to do. Unity's physics will literally take care of the rest. And the nice thing about it is, even though we've developed the game, we've got no idea what kind of death sequences are going to be waiting in store for us. And I remember when Ragdoll Physics was first implemented in some of the first games that I played that used it, there was so much fun to be had because, you know, every now and then a character would die in and end up in just such a ridiculous pose. So let's get back to our project now, and let's talk a little bit more about what joints are and how they relate to rigid bodies. And I think to do this, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to save my current scene and I'm going to create a brand new scene in Unity so that we can use this just for testing. I'm not going to save this off. I'm not creating anything here that's a work of art I want to keep around. I'm just going to show how we can put two rigid bodies in the scene and connect them with a character joint. Now the reason I'm doing this is because although Unity has this wonderful feature called the Ragdoll Wizard, which allows Unity to essentially ragdoll our bone hierarchies with just the touch of a button, the Ragdoll Wizard doesn't always get it perfectly right, and sometimes you need to go in and tweak some of the joints. So it's good to have an understanding of how the joints work so that you can resolve any issues as and when they arrive. Now, Unity, the joint is the means by which we connect rigid bodies together. We can create huge strings of rigid bodies in hierarchy, each one with a joint connected to another rigid body. There are also many different types of joint available. We can have a hinge joint, a spring joint, and of particular interest to us, the character joint. When rigid bodies are connected by joints, they are still unique rigid bodies in the scene, undergoing all the same physical forces as if they were an unattached object. It's just that their freedom to move and rotate is limited with respect to the object to which it's attached by the parameters of the joint. What makes the character joint so useful is that it allows us to specify unsymmetrically the restraints of the main twist axis. A hinge joint, for example, might have a limitation such that if we set it to 60 degrees, means that from the point of origin, the attached rigid body has the freedom to rotate 30 degrees forward and 30 degrees back. With a character joint, we can specify for that same twist axis that the attached rigid body might be able to rotate, say, 70 degrees forward, but only 10 degrees back. This is very useful and necessary when we are connecting bones in a skeleton. As an example, hold your right arm out in front of you, fully extended, with the hand twisted such that the palm of your hand is facing the ceiling. If we imagine that your forearm is one capsule collider and your upper arm is another capsule collider, the elbow is where the joint would be. If this is a character joint, we can specify for the main twist axis, which would be running left to right through your elbow, that we don't wish to allow any rotation of the forearm backwards, but we wish to allow a large degree of rotation forwards. I can't rotate my forearm backward independently of my upper arm, but I can curl my forearm forward and bring my hand right up to my chest. This is exactly what the character joint allows us to do. So let's see how we set up joints and how we connect two rigid bodies together. Using the arm analogy, I'm going to add two capsules to the scene, make sure they have colliders on them, and then give them rigid bodies so that they are influenced by the physical forces of the physics system. I'm then going to connect them with a joint. So I'm going to go to the Game Object menu, the 3D Object submenu, and I'm going to choose to create a capsule. I'm going to click on the capsule in the hierarchy view, and I'm going to rename this first capsule Lower Arm. I'm going to move my game view down here. It's just getting in the way at the moment. I want to work in the scene view. With the lower arm selected, I'm now going to right click, I'm going to duplicate it, and I'm going to rename the duplicate Upper Arm. I'm then going to move the upper arm up such that they are just touching at the tips. What I've mocked up here is the upper arm on top and the lower arm on the bottom. Now if I press play at the moment, these capsule colliders don't have rigid bodies attached to them. Therefore they just stay in the scene as static colliders. So let's fix that now by selecting both of those capsule colliders, calling up the inspector window, hitting the add component button and choosing to add a rigid body. Now that they both have non-kinematic rigid bodies attached, if I press play, we will see the two capsules fall under the force of gravity. It may also be useful for this demonstration for me to have a floor for these capsules to fall on. So I'm going to go to the Game Object menu, the 3D Object submenu, and I'm going to add a cube. I'm going to move the cube underneath them, and then I'm going to scale the cube up quite drastically on the x-axis and on the z-axis, and there I have a nice floor to play with. If I press play now, we should see them land on the floor, as we have indeed done. At the moment though, these two capsules are not connected in either way. To do that, we need to add a joint. And in this particular case, as we're mocking up an arm, we're going to use the character joint. So I'm going to select the lower arm first of all. I'm going to, via its inspector, hit the add component button. Then I'm going to type CHAR and choose character joint. Look in the inspector, we now have a character joint component. And you can see that the first property of the character joint is where we get to drag in a connection to another rigid body. You can probably imagine how we're going to make this connection. We're going to drag the upper arm game object from the hierarchy view and we're going to drop it in that slot. The lower arm is now connected to the upper arm. If we press play now, we won't see a lot of difference first of all, but that's because these objects are on top of each other. But if I start to pull the lower forearm around, you can now see that they are indeed connected. To show this better, let's now add another joint to the upper arm, and you're going to see something else that's quite cool. If we add a character joint to the upper arm, what are we going to connect this to? In a real situation, we'd probably connect it to a spine joint or a shoulder joint or a neck joint or something like that. But what you can also do is specify no rigid body to connect it to. When you do this, the joint is connecting the object to that position in the world. Let's see what happens when I press play now. I'm going to select the lower arm and I'm going to start moving it around. And you'll see that what we have is almost like a chain. Cool, isn't it? And as you can see, the upper forearm is connected to that position in the world with, once again, the same kind of joint. So it's able to rotate within the restrictions specified by the joint at that position in the world. Let's now examine some of the fields in the character joints inspector. We don't need a good understanding of all of them. I'll just point out some of the more common ones that you may need to modify if Unity's Ragdoll Wizard doesn't ragdollify your zombie correctly the first time. The first field in the character joints inspector is obviously the body it's connected to. In the case of our lower forearm capsule here, we can see it's connected to the rigid body of the upper forearm. The anchor field allows us to change the position of rotation for the hinge. Now by default Unity will normally set this up correctly, and furthermore puts a little gizmo at the point of the anchor. As you can hopefully see here, we have a little gizmo at the top of our first cylinder that shows the point of rotation, and we also have an orange arrow that indicates the primary axis. This is the axis that we're essentially going to be able to set two different rotational limits for, depending whether it's clockwise or anti-clockwise rotation. Therefore, in the case of an arm, we would want this to be the axis that runs through the elbow horizontally. So if you imagine now, we're looking at an arm that's side on. So imagine we're looking at the right side of a character who is looking in this direction. So imagine this arrow is his nose. Then we would expect the arm to sort of bend and curl up forwards without any problem, but we wouldn't want it to be able to rotate back. And the only axis that we have that control over is this orange axis here, which is called the twist axis. Of course, we might not want a joint just to be able to rotate around that one twist axis, so we also have the ability to set a symmetrical limit for the other two axes as well. Swing axis 1 is indicated by this arrow, which is pointing up in this example, which shows the second axis of rotation, and the third axis of rotation isn't shown in the gizmo but is assumed to be the axis that is perpendicular to the other two. One of the things the Ragdoll Wizard can get wrong is it can often set up your joints such that the primary axis, which remember is the orange arrow in this diagram, can actually be facing the wrong way. When that's the case, we can change the direction of the axis here. Let me zoom in a little bit so we can see that arrow a little bit more clearly. Unfortunately, they're not very big. So you can see at the moment it's facing this way. But if I set that to 0 and then set it to say 1, you can see the primary axis is now pointing up. This isn't what we'd want for an arm. In fact, if I go back to the production version of Dead Earth and look at our rigid body's outline, you get a pretty good idea of how these primary axes should look. One of them has actually been set up wrong in this example, so we'll fix it. So notice how on the arms the arrows point up. This is exactly what we want. This should be the primary axis of rotation. Remember, if the axis is pointing up, the rotation is around that axis, not in the direction of that axis. In the case of the head, we would actually want the arrow pointing out to the left, because we want the head's primary axis to be the one that allows the head to look up and look down. We want the character to be able to look down and look up in the sky, but we don't want them to rotate the head so much that they can look behind them. Here you can see for the forearm, the twist axis is not pointing up, but is pointing out. So let's choose the left arm. Let's choose the left lower arm here. Let me zoom in so I can see it. It's bloody hard because the gizmo gets in the way. I can't see what's... And I think what we need to do there is probably set the axis around Z. Let me try that. No, is that right? Oh, it's almost right, but it's pointing down instead of up. So let me set that to -1 on the Z. And you can see that this axis field here in the inspector is how we set the axis that the primary twist axis of rotation is aligned to. So you can see now if I go up to Jill again and select Jill, those arrows are pointing up and the axis of rotations are right. And this is probably the only modifications you're going to need to make if the Ragdoll Wizard messes it up. Once again, if we look at the legs, if we look at the boxes that are bounding the spines, the axes are all correctly pointing to the left. So that's exactly what you want it to look like. So if we go back now to our test scene, we can see that if we were indeed looking at the character from the side on, the axis is in the right direction. So let's now look at the character joint inspector again and just concentrate on some of the more important fields in the inspector and just briefly describe what they do. So we have the anchor position, which we now know is essentially the position of the joint, at least relative to this rigid body. And we also have the axis vector where we can set the direction of the twist axis, the primary axis that will allow us to have two rotational thresholds. Underneath that, you'll see that we have this field called connected anchor. At the moment, we've got this little tick box tick that says auto configure the connected anchor, so that Unity will automatically resolve where the connected anchor should be. The connected anchor is the point on the connected rigid body that we're considering our joint is attached to. So you can see that Unity's done a pretty good job of auto-computing the point at which this rigid body and its joint connects to the other rigid body is at the bottom of that rigid body. But we can change that. Let's just remind ourselves what it looks like before we change it, where we can see that the joint is indeed at the bottom of the upper capsule and at the top of the lower capsule. If we now turn off auto configure connected anchor, let's just move it down a little bit. Let's move it down. Can you see that the connected anchor point moving down? What's going to happen when I press play now is this joint that we've created is actually going to attach itself to that anchor position now, that new anchor position. Look, it now thinks that that is the position at which it needs to attach to the rigid body above it, which in itself is quite cool. By the way, you can also see when I pull this rigid body, notice how the twist axis, we can see the two rotational limits being used. Notice when I pull up that rigid body, it rotates quite a bit forward, but as it goes back, you can see there isn't much rotation backwards at all around that twist axis, and that's exactly how an elbow would work, but we can probably limit that even more so it doesn't rotate backwards at all. We'll look at that in a moment. So you have the ability to change the point at which we are anchored to the connected rigid body, but I'm going to set that back to auto configure, and Unity should correctly put that back to the way it was at the point where they overlap. So the primary axis we said is called the twist axis. So the secondary axis pointing up is the swing axis. As you can see, there is a vector that also allows us to configure that. Furthermore, with most joints we also have the ability to control what happens when the joint is not at its position of rest. We can often apply a spring force to it so that if we bend the arm up, it won't stay there. The joint will try to force itself back using the spring to its position of rest. So you can see that we have the twist limit spring that allows us to set a spring force and a damper force to configure that. And we also have the same thing for the other two axes as well. Swing one limit, which remember is this grey arrow pointing up, this axis, and spring 2, which remember is the axis which isn't shown on that gizmo but would be perpendicular to the other two. And we can set the rotational limits around those two other axes, and we can also set the bounciness such that when the joint reaches its limit on that axis, it can actually bounce back. But the thing that's important to us here is configuring the two rotational thresholds for the twist axis, which is our main axis. And as you can see, we have low twist limit and high twist limit, and at the moment we've got it set so the high twist limit, which is the limit at which our lower arm here can rotate forward or counterclockwise around that orange arrow, is set to 70 degrees. So let's put it up even more. Let's put it to 120 degrees. Let's go crazy. And the lower test limit is how much it can rotate backwards from its point of rest, which you can see is only set to minus 20 degrees. I'm going to set that to 0, and it should look very much like how a human arm would work. So as I pull this up now and let it go, you can see it can rotate quite a lot, but look what happens when I let it go. It doesn't allow it to rotate backwards at all. Now in reality, especially if you're double jointed, you can get a little bit of rotation back there. So maybe we should set the low twist limit to say minus 10. Let's see if that looks a little more organic. Yeah, I think that looks better, don't you? And like I said, the other two axes as well, you can set their swing limits down here. Swing limit 1 and swing limit 2, but you'll notice that they have a single symmetrical limit that goes either side of the position of rest, and that's what the character joint gives us for that twist axis. It allows us to set the low twist limit and the high twist limit, and that's why the direction of that orange arrow is really important. Just to labour the point one last time, if we look at the twist limit axis for the head, you can see that this is the right choice, because although our head has to rotate left and right, we can use one of the secondary or tertiary axes for that, where we set a single rotational limit that works both ways. But for the looking down and looking up, well, we don't want them to look down too much, or their chin might go into their chest, and we certainly want to limit the amount they can look up so they can't roll their heads back so far that they're actually looking behind them. Anything else on here we need to talk about? Oh, probably the only other thing we need to talk about, although we're not going to be using it, is we can enable collision. Now at the moment, the lower capsule is set not to collide with the rigid body which it's attached to, and that's often what you want, because obviously we have embedded these capsules in each other slightly so that it looks like we have a nice smooth skin from the outside. But you can see if I turn on collision and then press play, you should see the bottom capsule. Did you see it? It unembedded itself, and now it can look a little bit different, because although the actual joint parameters allow us to rotate that bottom capsule forward by quite a wide number of degrees. The actual collision system isn't letting us do it because it's as soon as we start to pull it up, it tries to resolve the collision. Normally you're not going to want that, so I'm going to turn enable collision off. Finally, we also have brake force and brake torque. Currently this is off, it's set to infinity, which means that it doesn't matter how much force or how much rotational force, which is torque, we apply to the joint, it will never snap and break. But if you were doing, for example, the model of a train, let's say you had a load of train carriages that were linked together by either character joints or hinge joints, and then the train derailed, you might want to set the joint so that a certain amount of force was applied to the carriages, those links would break, and then the individual carriages could break apart, roll down an embankment or something like that. But we definitely don't want to use that for a character model, because if we break apart the bones and they go off in their own directions, like I said, they're still going to be covered by a single skinned mesh, and the skin will stretch horribly out of shape. Okay, so we understand now what a character joint is, how it works, and how it should look, so that if the Ragdoll wizard does mess up any of our joints, we can set them straight again. So let's go back now to our scene with Zombie Jill in it, and let's ragdoll her. So here I am back in our test scene, and once again I have been joined by the delightful Zombie Jill, and I'm using the scene view here. Okay, so I've just moved the game window down to the bottom, and I've navigated the scene camera so that we've got Zombie Jill on the screen so we can see what's happening. So fortunately, setting up a ragdoll for a character in Unity doesn't mean that we have to manually visit all of the influential bones, add capsule colliders, add character joints, add rigid bodies. Unity has the Ragdoll wizard that does that. Now, just in case you don't know what a wizard is in application terms, it's not something like Gandalf that casts spells and keeps darkness away. It's just a dialog box that comes up and automates some of these steps for you. So let's go to the game object menu. Let's go to the 3D object submenu, and let's choose Ragdoll. And that brings up the Create Ragdoll dialog, which is not dissimilar to the avatar configuration dialog that we used many lessons ago when we were setting up our humanoid avatars. And you'll notice that each of the bones that the Ragdoll wizard is interested in is labeled, and we have a transform slot next to it where we can make those assignments. So as you can see at the top, the first bone that we should assign is Zombie Jill's pelvis bone or hip bone. Now of course, depending on where you got your character from, whether you authored it yourself or whether it's a third-party asset, the names of the bones in the skeleton and their layout can vary slightly. So you have to use a little bit of common sense here to figure out which bone names in your skeleton match up the bone names that have been asked for by Unity. So I can see that in this particular case, the pelvis means my hips. I can see for my left hip, that should be my upper left leg. So I'll drag over the left leg bone. And for the left knee, that should probably be my left leg, which is like the lower left leg. And then finally for the left foot, well, I've got a bone called left foot, so that's an easy one. And then we'll do the same for the right side of the character. For right hips, it means the right upper leg. It means for right knee, it should be the right leg, or, you know, what's supposed to be the right lower leg. And for the foot, the right foot. Okay, so we're going to close up the legs. Now we're going to configure the arms. Just looking for the left arm first of all. And you see it says left arm and left elbow. So that's like the upper left arm and the lower left arm. So the arms are normally connected to the spine. So if I drill down into my hierarchy, I've got spine, spine 1, spine 2. And then if I just move the dialog out of the way so I can see what I'm selecting. There you go, left shoulder. And if I drill down into the left shoulder, we can see we have left arm and left forearm, so upper arm and lower arm. So I'm going to drag the left arm into the left arm slot and the left forearm into the left elbow slot. And then I'm going to do the same by drilling into the right shoulder and then make those connections with the right arm and the right forearm in the arm and elbow slots respectively. So the next thing that it's asking for is the middle spine joint. So let's see where those are. Yeah, we've got spine 1 and spine 2. So spine 1 is probably the middle spine joint. And finally, it's asking for the head. So the head is connected to the neck. There's another bone connected to the neck called neck 1. I'll draw down into neck 1, and there is our head bone. So let's now drag the head bone over, and it looks like we are ready to hit the create button. Don't worry about the strength property here. Don't think it does anything. Total mass is perfectly okay. I use that all the time. 20 is a good default, and we don't need flip forward. So let's hit the create button. Okay, so what's happened here? Has anything happened? Oh yes, it has. Look, Zombie Jill now has ill-fitting colliders over all of her body parts, or at least those body parts that we set up. And this is pretty much how it works. Once you create the ragdoll, you need to go in and you need to resize those capsule colliders so they more closely bound the actual mesh, because obviously we can see at the moment that if you look at the forearms, the capsule colliders are like way too fat. So if this zombie was led on the ground using the physics system for its final positioning, obviously it would look like that these arms were sort of hovering a little bit, because the colliders are much bigger than the arm. It's the collider that would be resting on the floor, and the arm would be inside the collider and levitating off the floor a little bit. So we're going to want to sort those out, and let's have a look at what's happened with the joints. Well, you can see Unity has messed up the joints in the same place again. Well, you can see if you look at the joint between the forearm and the upper arm, on both sides, you can see the twist axis isn't pointing up, it's pointing out. So we'll need to address that. But I think everywhere else, from what I can see, let me turn off Jill's mesh a minute and just select a bone hierarchy. I think the joints look okay apart from that. Obviously, Jill's head looks a bit small as well, doesn't it? If you look at the head collider versus the size of her head, it's more like a face collider, isn't it? So we're going to go in and adjust all those now. So let's start by correcting those joints between the forearm and the upper arm on each side, where we can see that the twist axis is actually pointing out towards the camera here instead of up at the sky. So I'm going to start on, the right arm. So I'm going to go to the right forearm, and it's very hard to see, isn't it? There it is. Let's see that little orange arrow there, and we can see that at the moment it's going down negative X. So I'm going to zero that out, and I'm going to put it down negative Z, and you can see it's now pointing up in the sky. And I'm going to do the same for the left forearm as well. So open up the left shoulder, left arm, left forearm, and we should see exactly the same thing is true. Yeah, so we set the axis 0 out in the X and set it to -1 in the Z, and there you go. If I go back and select all of it now, we should be able to see that all of the joints along the forearm, and you can see this especially well when the characters in a T-pose, are all pointing up, which is exactly the direction that the twist axis should be pointing in. So now we're going to address the colliders, and this is just a simple case of just going in just like you would adjust any other collider. So if I start on the left forearm, actually I'll start on the right forearm, as I'm nearest that at the moment, and we just adjust the radius and the height of the collider. So let's start to bring that in a little bit. The height, I've got no problem with the height. It doesn't matter if the height of the capsule goes out further than the arm. That's not going to be a problem. We probably still want it to be smaller than that. Probably something like that. I mean, it's better that it's too small than too big. Because if it's too small, then when the character's sort of led down, the worst thing that can really happen is the bottom of the arm might be slightly embedded into the floor. I'd rather have that than the other way around, where it's sort of hovering in the air. So I used a radius of 0.04. So I'm going to go and apply that same change to the left forearm now. 0.04. Oh, it's also worth mentioning as well that because these are just standard physics objects now, we can apply materials to each of these colliders as well. So if, for example, we shot the character in the chest, we ragdolled it, and then as it fell backwards on the floor, we felt the rigid bodies were sliding too much along the floor, we could add materials to give those colliders more friction. But for now, we'll just leave them with no material assigned. Next up, let's drill down and adjust the size of the head, because that's quite a way off at the moment. And of course, that's a sphere collider, so we really just have to adjust the radius, and then I will, in fact what I should probably do here is I should probably go to isometric view, shouldn't I? Then I can really see what it looks like. There you go. So I think I'll set it to about 0.13, like that. Looks good to me. Let's now check out the spine. Once again, I'm staying in isometric here so I can see what it looks like without perspective getting in my way. So spine 1 is the chest. which to be honest doesn't look that bad, does it? It might be able to come over a little bit. It's really important when we're adjusting the colliders that we don't try and use the gizmo, because that will move the actual bone, okay? And that's definitely not what we want. So we need to adjust, in this case, the box collider by using its size and center properties in the component. Maybe something like that. Yeah, I think that looks all right. And then we'll go down to the hips as well. See, the hips have been pushed back probably a little bit too much. The hips is this second box here. Let me just check. The width is okay. So I'm going to move that box forward by adjusting its Z position as well. What I might do actually is just make these boxes a little bit smaller, like so that there is some room for the separate boxes to kind of to move around a little bit. Yeah, like that. Let's have a look at the legs. What's going on here? Well, we can see that the lower legs are obviously too big. So I'm going to drill down into the right leg here for a moment, and I'm going to adjust the radius to something like that. What did I use? 0.07. I'm going to do the same for the other leg as well. 0.07. The height of them look fine. I mean, Unit has done a pretty good job there of making sure that the very base of the capsule is pretty much where the foot would meet the ground. So I think probably, it's a bit hard to tell with this character because she's wearing a gown, but it looks to me that the upper leg colliders are a little bit big as well. So we'll start with the left upper leg, and we'll move that radius down a little bit. A little bit more perhaps, 0.08, and I might just move it along a little bit as well. 0.01, yeah, something like that. So 0.01 locally along its z-axis and a radius of 0.08. So I'll copy those properties over to the upper right leg now as well. So 0.08 for the radius and 0.01 nudging it forward. I think we now have our ragdoll looking pretty correct. Okay, so if I press play now, nothing will happen to Jill because the animator is controlling her bones. And in fact, we may see it's a little bit jittery as well. You're not really seeing it here, but you will find at times, because the physics system is being overridden by the animation system, you can get some pretty nasty artifacts. So in order for Jill to become a ragdoll and for those physics objects to control where the bone positions are, we need to turn off the animator. Now obviously when we update our state machine code in a moment, we're going to have some code that allows us to turn off the animator if the zombie's health reaches 0, or if it's been shot in the head or something like that. And as soon as we turn this off, this is going to happen to zombie Jill. Now the physics system is in control of all of her bones. Pretty good stuff, huh? Let's play that again and see. Actually, let me not select Jill so we don't have all of those outlines around her. Oh, wow. You can see at the moment in that position there, it looks like we could provide more rotation in her legs. It looks like they're kind of locking out at a sit position at the moment. So we could certainly go and adjust that. But, you know, that's it. We've just ragdolled Jill. And you can see if we pick her up, we can move her around. Oh dear. So now what's happening now is something else. Something else I forgot to mention is obviously when we ragdoll Jill, you've also got to make sure that we turn off her nav agent as well, because what's happening there is she's being dragged around. Okay, so let's turn off the nav agent and now see what happens. Okay, now we can sort of pick her up and throw her around. Oh, by the way, guys, something else that we'll do as well is when we ragdoll her, we'll also make sure that we turn off this capsule collider up here, where she's become sort of detached from that, because we don't want, if the zombie is like a pile of bones on the floor, we don't want this solid collider still being here, or the player would walk over to inspect the body and might actually walk in to into this collider. And what we're also going to do later on, not in this video, but probably in the next video or the next couple of videos, is we're going to write some code that's going to try its damnedest, with varying degrees of success, to reanimate a ragdoll back into an upright position, which is once again being controlled by the animator. Now games, I haven't really seen them do this very often, and this is something that we're going to do. Normally when you ragdoll something, it just ends up in a completely random position, so obviously it's going to be very difficult to start animating again without the bone position snapping to the first frame of the recovery animation. But we're going to do some clever kind of blending between the current position of the rigid bodies and what the animator is telling us should be the position, to try and get something which, 80% of the time will look pretty reasonable and will allow us to shoot a zombie in the head, see it fall down a flight of steps, and we think it's dead, and then we walk up to it, then all of a sudden we see it start to get to its feet again, and that would be truly terrifying. So if you haven't done this before, congratulations, you've just made your first ragdoll. Oh, and if you're interested in giving more flexibility to those joints between the lower leg and the upper leg, then obviously you would just choose the left leg like so, and we would be able to adjust the low twist joint and the high twist joint. At the moment it's set to 80, so it's not even set to allow a right angle, which is exactly what we're seeing. So we could probably set the low twist angle there to, let's say, 130. I'm going to do the same for the right leg as well. So I'm going to select the right leg, change that to minus 130. And when I press play now, we should see that Jill won't lock so readily into that sit down position. Actually, did I turn back off? I've got to turn back off the animator and the nav mesh agent. Press play and you'll see, there you go. There you go, we fixed the joint. So that's how easy it is. And you'll probably want to, as you experiment with the various death sequences, you might start to find that you wish certain joints had a little bit more articulation, and that's exactly how you would do it. So just to labour the point one more time, if we were to go back to the left leg again and put that to a lower amount, like let's just say 30 and 30, you're going to see there's going to be hardly any bend in her knee now when she ragdolls. So you can really change the way that the ragdoll behaves in physics using these joints. But I'm going to set them back, I think, to about 120. And 120 for the other leg. Press play again. That looks good to me. Now, although I was unable to demonstrate the artifacts of a problem that we have at the moment, it doesn't mean that it's not still there. It also doesn't mean that even if the artifacts weren't there, how we have Jill configured for normal animation mode is efficient. You see, when we created the ragdoll, on all of those influential bones, we created non-kinematic rigid bodies. Non-kinematic rigid bodies are rigid bodies that the physics system thinks that it has to manage, which means even when Jill is in full animation mode, the physics system will still think that it has to compute the positions and the rotations of each of those colliders that we've just added comprising Jill's ragdoll. Therefore, when Jill is not a ragdoll, all of those colliders that we just added should be set to be kinematic rigid bodies, not non-kinematic rigid bodies. So let's select all of those bones that we added as part of the ragdoll process. That was the hips, the upper left leg, the lower left leg, the upper right leg, the lower right leg, spine 1, the left arm and the left forearm, the head, the right arm and the right forearm. With all of those rigid bodies now selected, in the inspector we will set is kinematic to true. When we do this, if I select Jill's AI entity and then press play again, you'll now see that the physics system is not paying any attention to those rigid bodies whatsoever. Well, I misspoke a little bit there. Of course it's still paying attention to them, but it's no longer applying physical forces to them or trying to calculate the position and the rotation of those colliders. Instead, the physics system now just sees these as dynamic colliders that are going to be dragged around by the animation system. That means we're not wasting time having the physics compute a load of positions and rotations for a load of rigid bodies that we don't need because they're going to be overwritten by the animation system anyway. Of course, when we ragdoll Jill, that means we no longer have to just turn off the animator and the nav mesh agent, but we also have to visit each of those rigid bodies and set their is kinematic booleans back to false. This will be in our AI state machine code when we update it in the next lesson. So if I turn on the animator, turn on the nav mesh agent, Jill should now animate without any problems. Yes, she is. However, even when Jill is in fully animated mode, these colliders are not going to go to waste. They give us some vital information. They tell us where the capsule colliders are for all of Jill's individual body parts. When the player shoots the zombie, it's actually going to be these colliders that we're going to be performing ray tests against, which will allow us to know what part of the body we've hit and where to apply forces and where to apply damage to the zombie. Now, just because they're kinematic rigid bodies doesn't mean that we still can't perform ray tests with them. So that's exactly what we're going to do. In fact, many lessons ago, we actually created a layer that we're yet to use called the AI body part layer. And it's that layer that we're going to assign all of those ragdoll colliders to. And then in our code, when we do a raycast, we'll be able to determine not only if we've hit a zombie, but also the body part on the zombie we've hit. Furthermore, you could see that if we didn't have these body parts bounded like this, and I just select Jill's AI entity, the only other collider that we would be able to use is Jill's overarching capsule collider, which is way bigger than Jill's actual bounds and may not tightly fit the current animation pose that she's in. So we could have a situation where a test registers a false positive. We could think we've hit the zombie when really we hit a bit of her collider that was to the left or right of her head. So in order to assign that AI body part layer to our ragdoll colliders, we have to select them all again. So that's the hips, the left upper leg, the left lower leg, the right upper leg, the right lower leg, spine 1, left arm, left forearm, head, right arm, right forearm, and we will, in the inspector, from the layer menu, choose AI body part. Now this is asking me if I wish to apply this layer to any children that may exist as part of these body parts. That's not necessary, so just say no, and we're going to apply that layer to only the body parts that have colliders on them added by the Ragdoll wizard. Okay, so what we need to do now is go into the edit menu, go into the project settings menu and call up the physics manager, because although we created that AI body part layer, we didn't actually set it up in the collision matrix. And the AI body part really only wants to collide with the basic geometry. So I'm going to turn off everything except default, which is what all our scene geometry will be on, and transparent effects. Now obviously if a little further down the line we create some other layers which have specialized geometry that we also want Jill's body parts to collide with, then we would also add a collision between the AI body part layer and that layer too. So at the moment Jill's body parts will only collide with the basic scene geometry, and that's exactly what we want. Furthermore, if I go back to the production version of Dead Earth, you can see that if I select, for example, Jill's lower leg, you can see that not only have I put it on the AI body part layer, but I've given it a tag called lower body. If I select her hips, it has the tag upper body. That's because in Dead Earth we basically implement two types of body damage that can manifest itself via custom layers in the animator. Now obviously we haven't created those custom layers yet, but the idea being is that I will have a basic walking animation like we have at the moment, but I will also have an upper body layer and a lower body layer where the zombie will be walking in a more damaged state. So if we shoot the zombie in the legs, it might get back up again, but it might start to limp. If we shoot it in the chest or if we shoot it in the arm, it might get back up again, but the top of the body might animate differently now with like an arm hanging down, almost like it has no life in it. I mean, you can go further again if you want and have individual layers that control the animations of, say, the left arm versus the right arm, the left leg versus the right leg. But for me, I just cut it into two parts. I have upper body damage and lower body damage. And in Dead Earth, when the zombie has reached 100% lower body damage, that basically means that the zombie is still alive, but its legs no longer work. And it's at that point that the zombie will then start to crawl towards you because its arms still work. And if you then shoot it in the chest a few times or in the arms a few times and you give it 100% upper body damage, well, now it can't use its arms or its legs, but it won't be dead. So it will literally just be there kind of writhing on the spot, still alive, but unable to get itself to you in any way. So little things like this I think make it really cool and add a little bit of variety in the animations that we see. So in order to do that, we're going to need to create some more tags. So I'm going to call up the inspector. I'm going to select AI entity, although it doesn't matter what object I select at this point. I'm going to pull down the tag menu and I'm going to select add tag, and I'm going to add two more tags. The first tag I'm going to add is going to be called upper body, and then I'm going to hit the save button. The next tag I'm going to add is going to be called the lower body, and I'm also going to hit the save button again. Actually, I misspoke. If I go back to the production version of Dead Earth again, I think I also have another tag that allows me to identify when I've hit the head, because obviously headshots are pretty fatal. So I'm also going to need to know when a headshot has been done. And yes, I also had a tag called head as well. So let's add that tag, that third tag, and we'll call it head. Then what we'll do is we will select Jill's body parts. First of all, I'll select her head, and I will assign that the head tag. So as you can see, Jill's head now is on the AI body part layer, but as the head tag. So when we shoot Jill and we detect the array that we've cast from the player has hit a collider on Jill, we'll be able to tell not only if it's one of her body parts, but also what body part it is. Is it going to be the head, which will automatically see Jill kind of drop to the floor and ragdoll, at least in the case of the attack weapon being a bullet or a projectile. Or we can detect whether it's upper body or lower body, and we can add some damage to the upper body and the lower body systems of Jill. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to select the right forearm, the right upper arm, the left forearm, the left upper arm, the spine one, and the hips, and I'm going to assign them the upper body tag. Then I'm going to select the left upper leg, the left lower leg, the right upper leg, the right lower leg, and assign those the lower body tag. So if we select these bones individually, you can see, like, if I select the hips, it's upper body. If I select the left leg, it's lower body. If I select the head, it's head. So we can now tell when the zombie is hit which category, if you like, of damage we should apply. Should it be lower body damage, upper body damage, or head damage? So I think I'm going to leave it there for now, so that when we come back in the next video, we can jump straight into writing some code that's going to allow us to implement the beginnings of our zombie damage system. Thanks for listening, guys. I will see you next time. Bye bye now.